we are going to get started. And today is not part of a series. We just kind of trying to figure out like what would be a good way to sort of enter into a new season, a new year. A lot of people, anytime a new year kind of rolls into, like anytime we roll into a new year, there's always kind of a mentality of like, okay, new things are about to start. We like it's sort of like a mental reset, even though I realize like time continues just to sort of like it's kind of a construct, like this made up thing that we started like, yeah, every January is a brand new thing. Like, no, it's pretty much the same as it was last week. It's just we changed like now we get confused anytime we have to like put a date on something, and now we have to like scratch out 25 and put 26 next to it. That's a totally normal thing that we have to do every year. But also it is sort of like this mental shift of like, if I'm going to try and do something new or better or different, now is probably as good a time as any, because like this is a time where everything's kind of like restarting, like I said. So we're going to try and enter into this year kind of reflecting on that mentality while also not at all. So we're gonna see. And I'm sure you're like, I don't know what you're talking about. So we'll get into that right now. So we do, I will say, have lots and lots of ground to cover, and I'll try and go as quickly as I can. We have a lot of information to give you, so I'll try and give that to you in digestible chunks if I can. So first of all, we're going to be looking at the book of John. In the Bible, we're going to be looking at chapter 1. It'll be up on the screen. If you don't have a Bible with you, that's totally normal. So we will have the passage up on the screen in a second. But just to kind of set things up, in John chapter 1, John is one of the four, what we often refer to as the gospel accounts, which means John is one of the four books in the Bible that we have that is a biographical account of the life of Jesus. There are four of them. There's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So John, being one of those biographical accounts, has several stories, kind of narrative stories that will kind of give you a notion of what was going on in the world around Jesus at the time that his ministry began, and kind of the narrative flow that kind of moves towards the death and resurrection of Jesus. So this is at the very, very beginning of that story in John chapter 1. So far in the book, and again, we're right in the first chapter, so we haven't missed a lot so far. So far, we haven't really gotten to know Jesus as a character at all yet, but we have a little bit gotten to know another guy who is also named John. Not the guy who wrote the book. It's another guy named John, who we often refer to as John the Baptist or John the Baptizer. And so John the Baptist has been, up to this point in John chapter 1, John the Baptist has been raising lots of questions and challenging lots of assumptions about faith and power and tradition and authority. And so he has kind of gathered a following. There are people who have begun to kind of go where he goes and try to practice what he practices in an attempt to sort of tap into whatever it is that he's attempting to do. And so he's doing a lot of things that are challenging kind of the traditional way that we've always kind of done things. And again, he's developed quite a following. So at one point, John sees Jesus and sees what Jesus is up to. And John says to his own followers, listen, you guys should actually be paying attention to what he's up to what Jesus is doing, because that's where everything is going to happen. That is going to be the center of the whole story. So if you really want to be in the middle of what's actually happening, you need to be following Jesus. So John, which is not a thing that most teachers at this time would have done, told his disciples, his followers, you should actually not be following me. You should be following that other guy. So in John chapter 1, beginning in verse 35, that is sort of the encounter that we're seeing. So in verse 35, it says this. It says, the next day, John was there again with two of his disciples. When he saw Jesus pass by, he said, look, the Lamb of God. When the two disciples heard him say this, they followed Jesus. Turning around, Jesus saw them following and asked, what do you want? Which is not what you expect Jesus to say to people who are like, can we please follow you? Or who just start following him without saying anything. Because we often imagine Jesus being like this, like blow-dried hair, white bathrobe, glassy-eyed kind of guy, like, yes, please follow me, my children. But that's not what Jesus does here. Jesus turns around, he sees these two guys, he's like, what do you want? And so they, being good Jewish disciples, answer a question with a question. And so Jesus says, what do you want? And they say, Rabbi, which means teacher, where are you staying? Which is not like the most normal way to respond to the question, what do you want? Like, follow-up question, where are you sleeping tonight? Because we might actually show up there. So they make it weird real fast. So they say, where are you staying? And rather than ask any follow-up questions here, Jesus says, apparently this is enough for Jesus to be like, oh, well, that's a great question. Where am I staying? And so he says in verse 39, he says, come, he replies, and you will see. So they went and saw where he was staying, and they spent that day with him. It was about 4 in the afternoon. Andrew, who is going to be an important part of the story, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the two who heard what John had said and who had followed Jesus. So we know that Andrew was actually one of John the Baptist's disciples, and now he has begun to follow Jesus. So the first thing Andrew, and so in verse 41, it says, the first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon and tell him, we have found the Messiah, that is the Christ. Now, having just come out of the Christmas season, we've all heard the word Messiah a little bit, but just to sort of get everybody on the same page with this, Messiah or Christ, Messiah is a Hebrew word, Christ is a Greek word, both sort of pointing in the same direction. Basically, this idea, when he says we have found the Messiah, what he's attempting to say in first century Jewish thought is there was this belief that at some point a revolutionary leader would emerge from within the people and help the people reclaim their connection with God and their national identity, to rescue them from their conquerors. There are actually other stories of people who were believed to be the, quote, Messiah in this context, who ultimately were killed by the Romans, which kind of basically eliminated them from the running of like revolutionary leader. And so what Andrew is saying to his brother Simon, basically he's saying, like, I think we found the guy. I think this is going to be the guy who helps us reclaim who we are and who rescues us from our oppressors, who at the time was the Roman Empire. So then in verse 42, it says, and he, Andrew, brought him, Simon, to Jesus. So Jesus looked at him, Simon, and said, you are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas, which in parentheses, it says, which when translated is Peter. So we're going to get back to this name change thing because that's kind of the center of what we're talking about. But a couple of things that we have to understand before we get to that. So one of the most important parts of the story is when John's disciples go to Jesus and begin following him, the first thing they say to him is Rabbi. They call him Rabbi. So the question then becomes, okay, well, what does that mean? What are they implying? What is the cultural significance of having called Jesus Rabbi? So the story happens at the beginning of what is often referred to, or it happens at the beginning of the first century or early into the first century, which is often referred to in Jewish history as the pre-rabbinic period. So here's what that means. For hundreds of years, for hundreds of years up to this point in Jewish history, all religion and cultural identity revolved around the temple. And so there is this temple in Jerusalem where everyone goes, not just for like Sunday morning, like this is what we do once a week to fulfill our religious commitments. This is the center of cultural life. So the temple, I cannot overemphasize how important the temple was to Jewish people in the first century. Not just the worship of God, but to remind you of who you are and the story that you inhabit. This thing that we've been a part of for thousands and thousands of years all centers itself around the temple. So you would go to the temple, and the priests who worked in the temple would perform rituals and ceremonies as a way of reminding you of who you are and what kind of story you're participating in. However, because of the conquest of the Roman Empire, because they are in the Judean territory, in that part of the country or in that part of the world, wow, I'm having a hard time with my words. They're in the Judean territory, which has been conquered by the Roman Empire. Now, a few hundred years earlier, there was a temple, and there was another empire who conquered this group of people called the Babylonians, and the Babylonians destroyed the temple and exiled the people for almost 100 years. And so what that led to was a deep sense of disengagement from who are we as a people. And so now they've re-entered this part of or they've gone back to their home territory. They've rebuilt the temple. And so now there is a certain amount of insecurity of, okay, we are now under the thumb of a different group of oppressors, but what happens when they decide they don't like our temple, or when they decide to get rid of our temple? Who will we be then? So they have a little bit of scar tissue that has led them to this place of, okay, if we are at some point without the temple, what would we do? So this is a very real question that they have to ask, because again, the temple is the center of this is who we are. This is what it means to be this like part of this story that we're a part of, to be us as a group of people. So because of the conquest of the Roman Empire, there is a real fear among the people that Rome is going to limit or restrict or even completely cut off the people's access to the temple. In fact, this had already begun a little bit. So one of the things, there's so many different rabbit trails we could go down. We will not do that just for the sake of your time. But I could talk about this all day. But one of the things that had happened, so deep into the story of Jewish faith and theology is the story of the Exodus. And the most important holiday in Jewish culture at this time, and even up till today, is the celebration of the Passover. The Passover is a story about an oppressed group of people who overcome and are freed from their conquerors, and then lots of their conquerors die as a result of it. Not a story that the Romans are going to be like, yeah, please go tell that story as much as you want. So what the Romans did was they went into the temple and they confiscate all of the most important elements that the Jewish people would use to celebrate Passover, and they kept it in the armory, which means they kept it with all the Roman weapons. And so basically they were like, listen, you can celebrate Passover if we allow it, but your priests have to come and ask us permission to get your stuff to go and celebrate Passover. And then when Passover's done, you got to bring it back. So as a way of sort of reminding the people, we are in control. We have the power. So the Roman Empire had already begun to restrict and limit access to certain parts of the temple and certain types of things that people did in the temple. So there already was this heightened level of fear about what happens when we don't have the temple anymore, which is what led to the rise of the rabbis. So this very real fear, a few decades later, in fact, a few decades later, the Romans actually do destroy the temple. So this is not like a completely like off the wall fear. So this anxiety gives rise to this subset of religious leaders called the rabbis. But again, it's the pre-rabbinic period, because the full rabbinic period does not take effect until after the temple is destroyed in 70 CE. You knew that already. Whatever. Why am I even telling you that? So from a very early age, so all that to say, rabbis are really, really important parts of the religious institution and structure, because again, if we don't have the temple, the rabbis sort of become the vessels of the temple work. So from a very early age, if you were a young Jewish boy living in this part of the world at this time, like around 5 years old, you would begin learning and memorizing Torah. If you're unfamiliar with this term, Torah is what is often referred to as the first 5 books of what we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures. So that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So that is Torah. Those are the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures. So when you're about 5, you begin learning and memorizing that. So imagine as a 5-year-old, instead of learning like vowels and consonants, you're learning Leviticus. That's, whew. Sounds exciting. So that was built into the culture. So if they were really, really good students, as they got older, they would soon go on to learn and memorize more and more of the rest of the Hebrew Scriptures. And by the time a young boy was about 12, the assumption was the best of the students would be able to not only engage and discuss, or to be able to recite and memorize these things, they would actually be able to engage and discuss other leaders and teachers. Which, by the way, again, another side tangent. You remember there's a story about Jesus when he's about 12 years old, and he and his family are traveling, and he gets lost, and they find him. Where do they find him? They find him in the temple. And the leaders in the temple are marveling at how good he is at having conversations about Torah. So we know that Jesus not only grew up in the structure, but he also had a knack for this kind of thing, which not surprising at all. So having been God gives one an advantage. So memorization was so thorough at this point that if you were to begin a quote from a passage of scripture, the young student, the name they would give the student was like Talmudim. And so the Talmudim would be able to effortlessly complete the quote. And so you'd be able to go back and forth, just starting and finishing each other's quotes from scripture. So by early adolescence, there would have been young boys who had memorized most, if not all, of Torah and the entire rest of the Hebrew Scriptures, the prophets, the poets, and all the rest. And so by early adolescence, you would have the best of the students would have already sort of locked in on a certain amount of mastery of this. So the best students would then go on to to study directly under the best teachers. And the very best of them would eventually become rabbis themselves. So that was the progression. You would be young students, then you would kind of move into Talmudim status, then you would become disciples, and then eventually, if you were good enough, you could become a rabbi yourself. So this was the most honored and revered like path of upward mobility in Jewish life at this time for a young man. So rabbis at this time, because rabbis are not bound by the temple, rabbis would travel from town to town. And before, people had to go to temple, but now it's almost as if the temple is going to the people, which indicates a major cultural shift. Again, once the temple is destroyed in the year 70. So by calling all of this to say, by calling Jesus rabbi, the writer is evoking this idea that Jesus is one of these early revered teachers. So let's imagine if you were a young Jewish boy at this time, one of your greatest dreams might have been to become the disciple of a great rabbi. So this is very common for Jewish boys. And so again, around mid-adolescence, a young Jewish boy who had come up through the system and felt like maybe I'm good enough. Maybe if I find a rabbi who will let me follow him, I could become that good. And so it would not be uncommon at all for a young boy around mid or late adolescence to go and find a rabbi and ask that rabbi, "Can I follow you?" Or, "Where are you staying tonight?" And so a rabbi would then ask a series of questions, not in like, "What do you want?" But would ask a series of questions like theological questions, or like just sort of like, "What are your thoughts on the Sabbath?" or whatever. And so they would begin an interaction, a sort of back and forth discussion. I think my brownies are ready. And so so the rabbi would begin a discussion with the prospective student, and at the end of the discussion, the rabbi either would say, "Come follow me," or the rabbi would say, "Go home and learn your father's trade." In other words, you are not good enough to be a rabbi, to be a disciple. So go home and learn your father's trade. Go learn your father's trade was basically a way of saying like this, like the thing that you most want to be in the world, you can't do it. You're not good enough. The father's trade, that's a fallback. That's like, well, if you can't do anything else, you might as well go back and learn your father's trade. So you just don't have it. I'm real sorry, kid. Go home. So there's another story, by the way, about two brothers named James and John. And there's a point, we're not even going to look at it, but there's a scene in the scriptures where Jesus sees James and John working their father's trade. They're fishermen. And Jesus says to James and John, "You come and follow me." And the scripture talks about how they dropped their nets and they began to follow Jesus. And as a high school student going to youth group, and hearing the story, I always thought there was some sort of like hypnosis involved. You know what I mean? Like there was this sort of like, kind of like they go into a trance, and the next thing they know, they're like 10 miles away following Jesus. And I always imagined also that their parents would have been super annoyed. Like the dad is like, "I left for 5 minutes. Like I told you guys to keep fishing, and now what?" And so so the two misconceptions I always had were one, that these guys basically just had no idea what they were doing, and they just followed Jesus just because it felt like that's what they were supposed to do, and that the parents probably were very like frustrated or disappointed. Nothing could be further from the truth on either of those fronts. So their father, by the way, if a rabbi comes to you, so first of all, if you're working your father's trade, that means a rabbi probably has already said to you, "Go home and work your father's trade." They have already been told you're not good enough. Two, what's going on here is if Jesus says, "Come follow me," obviously, like a rabbi just said, "Come follow me." Like, what am I going to not follow him? Are you crazy? I'm going to follow this rabbi. So obviously they're going to drop their nets. And so the other dimension of that is not only would their father not have been like annoyed or frustrated, this would have been like the proudest day of his life. The next day when he goes to sell fish in the local market, somebody would have been like, "Hey, I see your sons aren't with you." And he would have been like, "Oh, are they not? Oh, that's right. They're following a rabbi." Like this would have been a massive, like deeply proud moment for these guys' father. So in this time and in this place, to have a rabbi say, "Come follow me," this is a huge deal for a young boy, or for a boy of mid to late adolescence at this time. So all the way back to the story about Andrew. So when Andrew asked Jesus, "Rabbi, where are you staying?" He's saying, he wants to follow him. He wants to be his disciple. He wants to engage here as rabbi and follower, as rabbi and talmidim, not just to learn Torah, but also to see how he lives. The goal is to become as much like your rabbi as possible, not just to know what the rabbi knows, but to be like the rabbi. So, in fact, and this goes on to this day, by the way. There's a writer named Ray Vanderlaan who's written a lot about the culture of this and sort of how it's carried forward into present day. And Ray Vanderlaan, in one of his articles, tells a story about how one time he was in Jerusalem and he was in a public restroom, and a rabbi came into the public restroom, and all of the rabbi's disciples followed him into the restroom. And the rabbi goes into the stall, and all the disciples stand like literally right outside the stall waiting for the rabbi to finish. Because what if the rabbi has a prayer that he says before or after he uses the restroom? Like, well, I don't want to miss that. So they have to like literally follow as close to the rabbi as they can for like as much of the day, every day as they possibly can. What if the rabbi has something he does in the middle of the night? What if he wakes up at 2 a.m. and has a prayer or recites some sort of like poetic incantation or something like that? I can't miss it. So they have to like sleep near where the rabbi sleeps. So there's this like constant, like I have to be glued to the rabbi to know what the rabbi is like. In fact, there was a blessing at this time that again continues to this day, where someone, if you saw a disciple following a rabbi, the blessing that you would offer to that disciple would have been, may you be covered in the dust of your rabbi, which literally means if you're following your rabbi, may you follow closely enough to where when the rabbi kicks up dirt behind his shoes, it gets on your clothes. May you be that close to your rabbi. So that is like how deeply embedded this notion, I don't need that anymore anyway. That is how deeply embedded this whole idea of rabbi and disciple was. So imagine you are living at this time and you're working your father's trade, and this rabbi comes along and gives you a new name and says, follow me. Because we know Andrew already is following a rabbi, right? Because he's following John the Baptist. He is already a disciple. And so the next question though is like, but when he goes to talk to his brother, where does he go? He doesn't go back to a different rabbi and say, hey, you're following this rabbi, come follow this other rabbi. Where does he go? Simon is not following a rabbi. One of these siblings has been told, you are good enough. And the other one has very likely been told, you aren't. So Simon shows up. So Andrew goes and finds his brother and says, I think you're going to like this one. So Simon shows up. And instead of sending him home, like perhaps a different rabbi already has, Jesus gives him a new name. And what name does Jesus give him? He says, your name will be Cephas, which we learn is translated as Peter. So that's the setting for this whole story. So in Matthew chapter 16, we're going to look at another point along the way where Jesus tells. So again, we have 4 different accounts of Jesus's life: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. These kinds of things kind of show up in different places throughout the stories, and there's all kinds of possible reasons why. So in John, the renaming and the articulation of your name is Simon, now your name is Peter, like that happens very, very early in John. Matthew holds that back until Matthew 16. And it's possible that it happened before and he's just reiterating here. So don't let the order of things like get in the way. But in Matthew chapter 16, this is reiterated. So in Matthew 16, verse 13, it says, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? The Son of Man is a way he would refer to himself. They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others, Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But what about you? He asked, who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered him, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God, which we already talked about kind of what that vocabulary kind of means. Then in verse 17, Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock, which is a play on words because Peter is a Greek word that literally means like rock or stone. And on this rock, I will build my church and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. So Jesus reiterates from earlier, you had this name, but now you have this name. So the question then becomes, what's going on with the names? So, which obviously is everybody's next question. So we're actually given 3 different names for this one character, Simon, Peter, or Simon and Cephas and Peter. We're given 3 different names, all talking about the same guy. So Simon is a Hebrew name. It derives actually from the name Simeon, which originates in the book of Genesis. So his original name is a Hebrew name. or a Jewish name. So Jesus begins to call him Cephas. Cephas is an Aramaic name. It's generally agreed upon that Jesus mostly spoke in just like regular conversation. Jesus probably spoke Aramaic. So Cephas in Aramaic translates to rock or stone. And then Peter is a Greek name that literally means the same thing as the Aramaic name. So we have three different names, all in different languages, all kind of pointing towards different cultural signifiers. We have Simon, which is a Hebrew name, Cephas, which is an Aramaic name, Peter, which is a Greek name. So why not just call him Simon Cephas? Why change it to Peter? Why go to the trouble to change it like a couple of different times? So informal, common, I'm sorry. So the informal, commonly spoken language at the time was Aramaic. Again, this is probably what Jesus spoke in just like everyday conversation. The formal language at the time, like for educational purposes, for writing purposes, was Greek. So this was the language that transcended beyond just like particular geographic region. Like everybody at this point was either learning Greek or had already sort of gotten deeply embedded in Greek culture. So Greek was sort of the language that transcended like borders and boundaries. So it was common at this time for people in conquered territories to take on new names that reflected the culture of their conquerors. So from Hebrew to something more Greco-Roman. So like from a name like Simon to a name like Peter. So here's why this is interesting. Andrew tells Peter, "We have found the Messiah," implying that this is the person who is going to restore our cultural identity and rid us of anyone who isn't like us. The idea here is anything that is impure or not like fully Hebrew or Jewish, we're going to get rid of, and we will become more of like, we will become the pure people that we were always told that we could be. And so rather than like double down on Peter's Hebrew name, Simon, Jesus gives him a Greek name, which is almost to imply like, no, you're going to want that Greek name. You know what I mean? So right out of the gate, Jesus changes Simon's name, not to another Hebrew name, but to a name that will become more familiar to their conquerors and to the people who are also conquered by this people. So this effectively moves in the opposite direction of the closed off, like isolationist mentality that I think a lot of people probably were expecting for someone that they were calling the Messiah. Another dimension of this is this whole interaction in Matthew happens right outside of a city called Caesarea Philippi. So the city had only had that name. I keep losing my train of thought. So Caesarea Philippi had only actually been called that for about 5 years. And it's a freshly renamed city. Not unlike Peter himself, this city has gone through a renaming process. So when the Roman Empire, led by Caesar Augustus, had conquered the Judean territory, the city was called Paneas. So Caesar Augustus, once he conquers the Judean territory, finds a Jewish king, nominally Jewish, you could argue about how Jewish he really was, named Herod the Great. And he basically says to Herod the Great, "I will put you in charge of this territory as long as you will keep the order and keep the peace." And Herod the Great's response was, "Great, I will keep the peace as long as you make me rich." And they both did pretty well by each other. So Herod the Great conquers this territory, or holds this territory on behalf of Caesar Augustus. And again, the city's name up to this point is called Paneas. So Herod the Great dies. And so what happens after that, after Herod the Great dies, Caesar puts Herod's two sons in charge of the Judean territory, and he divides it. And Paneas goes to Herod's son, Philip. So in one of the single greatest acts of sucking up in all of world history, I have to rewind. So before Herod the Great dies, one of the first things he does in Paneas is he builds a giant temple of worship to Caesar Augustus, which is very scandalous and offensive for a Jewish king in a Jewish region to do something like that. So there's a giant temple and monument to Caesar in the middle of this previously very, very Jewish city. So Jesus takes his followers and is standing right outside the city. I'm so sorry. I just lost my place again. So eventually, again, Herod the Great dies, and Philip becomes in charge of Paneas. Herod the Great's son, Philip, is put in charge by Caesar to be in charge of this city. So Philip decides, like, well, I know my dad was pretty good at sucking up. Like, he was really good at it, but I think I can do a little bit better. So Philip changes the name of the city from Paneas to Caesarea Philippi. So he mashes together the name Caesar and the name Philip. So he's like, well, yeah, we worship Caesar here, obviously, but also like I'm pretty close with Caesar. So it's almost like he's signaling to Caesar, like, look, it's basically like we're best friends. If you really think about it, because it's named Caesarea Philippi. It's like for both of us. So that is why the city's name is Caesarea Philippi. So Jesus takes his followers and is standing right outside the city, which is named for both Caesar and this total sellout local king. And he says to one of his followers, you are Simon Peter. Your name is Hebrew and Greco-Roman. And so there is a mirroring element to this. In front of this city, which carries the names of both a Jewish king and a Roman emperor, a Greco-Roman emperor, Jesus says, you are also Hebrew and have some sort of Greco-Roman identifier as well. There's a mirroring element to this. So Jesus is saying to Peter, I realize you were sent home. And I realize at some point, someone told you, go home and learn your father's trade. This is not for you. You don't have it. And very few people had any faith in you. But Jesus is basically saying, not only do I see you and I believe in you, I am fully confident that one day you will stand in front of the most powerful people in the world and challenge the way things are done, which, by the way, totally happens and totally gets Peter killed eventually. So Jesus pulls Peter out of a place of rejection and obscurity and powerlessness and says to him, you are going to do things that change the world. He takes him to Caesarea Philippi and mirrors his name against the name of this city and says, you are going to do some things that are going to shake the world. Everybody else sent you home, but I see something in you that is going to change everything. Maybe who you are is not what other people have said you are. Maybe you have been told something untrue about yourself and it wounded you. And you have been negatively defined by this encounter or by this rejection or by this thing that somebody put on you in lots of painful ways. And there are scars and there is baggage and just even coming into spaces like this feels a little bit weird and a little bit uncomfortable. And I completely get that. Jesus giving Peter a whole new name and a way of saying, you are more than what you have been told that you are. Maybe this is a story about this guy thousands of years ago, but maybe it's a story about each of us. Maybe some of us need to hear something similar today. Maybe as we enter this new year, we are struggling with our place in the larger story. Maybe you need to be given a new name and be reminded of your role in the larger story that's being told. Maybe the story of Peter is your story. Maybe you've been told verbally or non-verbally that you are unwanted or unloved or unacceptable. Maybe you've been told that your value is equal to the amount of money that you can make or how nice your home is or how much power you have or how good you are at any specific kind of thing. Maybe there are certain like signifiers and roles that you play in your life. And somewhere subconsciously, if that thing went away, I would completely lose my value in the world. And there's a deep fear and insecurity that comes along with that. Maybe you've been told that because of your past, your value is limited for the rest of your life, that you are tainted, you are scarred, you are broken, and there is no recovery from whatever that thing was. And these names and these labels might have come from family. They might have come from your peer group. They may, in the most unfortunate circumstances, they might have come from previous churches. They might have even come from inside your own head. And it's possible that you carry these things around, these false narratives, these labels. Like maybe you have these voices whispering in your ear, telling you, like, yeah, go home. Just go learn your father's trade or whatever the equivalent of that is. Go make yourself small and make yourself invisible because no one really needs you anyway. Maybe you've been told that, either verbally or non-verbally. And I think the story of Peter, one of the things about Peter throughout the gospel stories is that Peter is a guy, but also a lot of times Peter stands in for the rest of the disciples, which means in a way he stands in for all of us. And so I wonder if there is some part of each of us that needs to be told, no, come follow me. You can do all kinds of new, amazing, incredible things. And no matter what story you've been told and no matter what labels have been placed on you, you can you can reclaim your own story, and you can hold on to you can have a new name, and you can be someone who participates in something that is beautiful and gives life to the world. You are not the negative labels and stories that you have been told. So maybe you need to be told that you are loved. Maybe you need to be told that you are enough exactly as you are, and that no amount of accomplishment, achievement, or checking off the boxes, or order, or possessions, or power is going to change how inherently valuable and good you are. You are accepted. Maybe you need to be told that your value is not wrapped up in who you know or what you can do. Maybe you need to be told that your wounds and your mistakes do not define you. You are more than the names and the labels that you have been given. Jesus calls Peter back out of obscurity. And not only does he say, like, okay, I expect you to be basically a C plus. No, he says, no, I'm going to take you and I'm going to place you in front of a city that is named for the two most powerful people in the known world. And I'm going to say to you, you are going to change everything. And so maybe you need to be told the same thing. So what does 2026 look like to you? Is it just a new version of 2025 with just a little bit more like joint aches and sleeplessness, or does it look like, oh, maybe there's some sort of new life that can be breathed into this story? Maybe there's a way I can engage the world around me in ways that I had been told weren't for me. You are loved and you are welcome. You are accepted. You are good exactly as you are. So may we embrace that, may we absorb that, and may we enter 2026 as if we believe that.